All right. So, hi, everyone, and welcome to our session titled Theorizing Filipinx Experiences in the Diaspora. I'm Chloe De Los Reyes, Assistant Professor at Crafton Hills College. And you want to introduce yourself, Mary?
Yeah, I'm Mary Mariano, adjunct extraordinaire at many different colleges. That's how I like to introduce myself.
Mary and I will be moderating the session and the Q&A following the presentations. We are anticipating an exciting hour and a half ahead of us, particularly because of the range of topics represented in this session. And at any time during the presentations, we invite you to submit your questions for the speakers in the chat. We will have some time at the end for discussion. One last note, this session came out of Mary's and I's desire to connect with and learn from other Filipinx in higher education, and we hope that we will have a dedicated Filipinx panel in PAMLA in the years to come. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mary so she can introduce our very first speaker.
Okay, do we have a list of who's first? I don't think I have that list.
Here you go, Mary. 1 second.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Oh, shoot. It's not letting me open it. Hold on.
I'll go ahead and introduce Jeremy.
Okay.
All right, so let's see. Jeremy Caramba is an undergraduate student from Camarillo, California. He is pursuing a bachelor's degree in film and television production at California Lutheran University. His work focuses on the current issues of the Filipino-American community in the United States. Jeremy Caramba, his presentation is titled Filipino-American Representation in Hollywood. Go for it, Jeremy.
Great, thank you. So I actually created a video presentation that I would like to share. And let me see if I can just share my screen. Okay. Is the sound working?
Can you try playing it, Jer?
You might need to hit the turn computer sound on before you share, so you might exit out first. Yeah, so stop sharing first.
I got it.
You got it? Yeah.
That's why I wore the Filipino flag on my chest when I did the Tonight Show. A lot of people always ask me, why'd you wear that flag on your chest when you did the Tonight Show? Because I wanted other Filipino kids that wanted to be a comic be inspired when they saw me that night. If they saw me that night, they would be like, yo, I can do that too.
In recent years, many films such as Crazy Rich Asians, The Farewell, and Minari have opened the door for greater Asian American representation in Hollywood. But in the case of Filipino Americans, underrepresentation in the American film and TV industry has been an ongoing issue. Especially when racial stereotyping has played a role in how Asian Americans and Filipino Americans have been portrayed, it's crucial to understand the importance of representation of underrepresented communities. The power of representation in culture can have a strong impact on an individual's identity and how people perceive that person outside of themselves. For Filipino Americans and other underrepresented communities, not being included in the narrative of what it means to be American can make those communities feel less important, underappreciated, and even makes it difficult for them to figure out their piece of the puzzle. Oftentimes, minorities and other communities of color face the consequences of misrepresentation in film and media.
You're looking at the face of a Filipino American man who was slashed while standing on a train to work.
I don't know if it is because of pandemic. I really don't know because I'm Asian. I have no idea.
These inaccurate portrayals of race can influence viewers who may not have much experience with people of color and are only limited to representations in the media. Therefore, only having negative portrayals or no representation at all can lead to misconstrued perceptions of minorities. Particularly in a time of anti-Asian hate, normalized negative representation can lead many people to believe that these misconstrued representations are true and justify their thoughts and actions against Asian Americans. It is important to highlight the different stereotypes depicted of Asian Americans in the media and why they are harmful to the image of those communities. One of the most commonly known stereotypes is the model minority. This stereotype upholds white supremacy by supporting the notion that aligning oneself with whiteness will be beneficial and maintains the belief that Asian Americans are foreign and a token commodity for white imperialism. The model minority is usually portrayed in film and TV as naturally smart, socially awkward, successful, and hardworking. This stereotype negatively affects the Asian American community, leading to mental health problems and self-esteem issues.
You would be surprised how effective stereotypes are to people. Even if you think you're smart and you understand that it's just a fake character, those things can get stuck inside all of us. So it's really important.
This is Masashi Nawano, Festival and Exhibition Director at the Center for Asian American Media. He takes part in CamFest, which is dedicated to promoting and supporting Asian filmmakers to a broad audience.
Again, this is really stripping away any nuance to who Asian Americans are. It's stereotyping us into this is what we are, and this is our motives. So kind of the foreigner stereotype of us coming over, not really caring about our the general community, but only about ourselves and our roots back home. I think that has been probably the most devastating thing, because it means to a lot of people, these Asian Americans are not Americans. Their real responsibility or connection is with their homelands.
These stereotypes often lead to microaggressions. Microaggressions are brief, commonplace, everyday indignities that can be verbal, behavioral, or environmental, and that have physical, emotional, and mental effects for those targeted by them.
Especially in a time of anti-Asian hate, it gives people ammunition to say those people are not us. They are caricatures. We can do whatever we want because they're not real people. Representation for underrepresented communities is really important.
Filipinos were not always represented positively in the media. In 2007, the popular ABC TV show Desperate Housewives faced backlash when actress Terry Hatcher's character made a distasteful comment about Filipino medical schools.
Susan, I know for a lot of women, the word menopause has negative connotations. They hear aging, brittle bones, loss of sexual desire.
Okay, before we go any further, can I check those diplomas? Because I would just like to make sure that they're not from some med school in the Philippines.
Look, there's a simple blood test.
Filipino medical professionals, as well as Filipinos in the United States and abroad, were infuriated over the line. Philippine health professionals and government officials demanded an apology from the ABC network and even declared a boycott of the show. In 2013, comedian Catherine Ryan made a derogatory joke about Filipino children in Mock of the Week, a BBC program. In a segment titled "Unlikely Lines from a Cosmetics Commercial," she stated,
"We don't test any of our products on animals. We use Filipino children."
This of course angered Filipinos in the United Kingdom and overseas, which led to numerous protests. Many claim that Ryan intended to poke fun at the absurdity of corporate priorities and the consumer's blind demand for non-animal tested products over more important interests. But it raises the question, why Filipino children? Although negative portrayals of Filipinos in mainstream film and television do not end there, we are getting better and more positive depictions that really help show off our culture and heritage. The popular musical comedy Crazy Ex-Girlfriend provides viewers with an accurate portrayal of Filipino Americans. In the episode titled My First Thanksgiving with Josh, Rebecca is invited to have Thanksgiving dinner with the Chan family, also played by Filipino-American actors. As a Filipino viewer, this show is refreshing because it showcases Filipino-Americans as different rather than abnormal, and is an accurate representation of the Filipino-American experience. The PBS Kids show Jelly, Ben, and Pogo follows a Filipino family and their adventures of working together to solve a problem. Each episode introduces children to Filipino cultural heritage, foods, and the Tagalog language, while teaching social and emotional growth and relationship skills.
Wow! Ang galing!
It is necessary to continue the discussion of the importance of Filipino-American representation and point out the racist portrayals of Asian Americans in the film industry. Especially at a time of anti-Asian hate, we need other communities of color and people who are passionate to stand up and advocate for greater Filipino-American representation. Asian American cinema in Hollywood is progressing, but telling stories within the bubble of Asian Americans is no longer enough. The future of Asian American cinema is expanding what it means to be Asian American in a larger group of BIPOC communities. With the recent hate crimes against the Asian American community, it is important to see more Asian American stories represented in the mainstream media to help fight and break down stereotypes and misconceptions, as well as build solidarity with other communities of color.
That's it for my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Chloe, shall we go to the presenter and then have questions for later?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Let me see, I'm going down to the, oh, right. Okay, so, okay, our next presenter, Jemuel Garcia. Jemuel is a Filipino fifth-year PhD candidate in critical dance studies with a designated emphasis in Southeast Asian studies at UCR. He is a fellow of the Fulbright Foreign Student Program and the Gluck Program of the Arts. His choreography weaves his passion for dance, music, storytelling, theater, and comics. As a transdisciplinary mover, his works were performed in countries like the USA, Thailand, Germany, Japan, and Spain. His research foregrounds an indigenous-centered decolonial and trans-Pacific dance studies lens to nuance the intercultural convergent experience of Filipino indigenous communities and folk dance companies in the homeland and the diaspora. Jemuel, welcome.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen. All right. Can you see the screen all right?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Good afternoon in Vegas. Good morning from where I am. I'm in Iloilo City, Philippines, and it's 6:40 a.m. So good morning.
Good
My name
morning.
is Jim, and you can call me Jim. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate, as Mary introduced me. I'm in the Critical Dance Studies program of UCR and the Department of Dance, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the organizers of PAMLA, including Craig, Chloe, and Mary for organizing this and for bringing us all together at this point. As I begin, I'd like to invite everyone who are watching or us here in the panel to listen, to put the palms of our hands where you can feel your heart beating. And we'll take a short pause as we listen to the pulse of our hearts. At this point, I would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to our ancestors and the ancestors of the lands we are in, wherever we are, and to where I am from, and to where most of us go to, especially in this time of a hybrid period of conferences. I am studying at the land of the Cobia, the Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples. and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future, and also all the people who have come before us, who have fought for us to be here today, and many of us have benefited from their work and continues to engage with their legacies. I'd like to acknowledge as well where I am right now, the land of the Panay Bukidnons and the Aitas in Western Visayas, Philippines. If there's one thing that my Filipino body felt in trying to understand the Filipino-American body in the last 4 years that I've been there in the United States of America, it was this potent mixture of confusion, questioning and gaze, and an unsure feeling, and let me call it ambivalence. One of those moments was when I decided to formally quit attending the folk dance rehearsals of an organization called Katipunan after being present twice in their evening practices. This UCR recognized organization, composed mostly of second-generation Filipino-Americans, was months ahead in preparation for the most anticipated cultural event in 2019, the Filipino Cultural Night. It is an annual program participated in by thousands of students, mostly Filipino-Americans. For curator of Asian Pacific American History and associate professor of American Studies, now curator of the Smithsonian Institute, Dr. Theodore Gonzalez, the production of PCN serves as a rite of passage for one's confrontation and refashioning of what it means for its participants to be Filipino-Americans. It became the most popular expressive culture endeavor for the increasing number of young Filipino-Americans in addressing their bodies, quote, to what has been perceived as the irreversibility of linear time, the inevitability of national formations, and the incommensurability of the Filipino experiences throughout the diaspora, end quote. In my own encounter with Katipunan, I felt mediocre, but trying, curious, but dissatisfied, and clarified, but also baffled. Then as I was composing an email with the intention of not coming back due to the cloud of doubtful bodily responses I had with the ongoing rehearsals, I started to ask myself, why do I feel this way? My presentation today is a slice of a full paper that nuances my experiences of ambivalence and place it in conversation with theories of racial and national affect. What I am attempting to nuance in this research in conversation with race-making in dance is the circulation of a simultaneously emerging but discordant affect that seemed to escape articulation. I focused my analysis on one of my two dance experiences with Filipino-American bodies in the last 4 years. One transpired during a folk dance rehearsal. I will draw from Associate Professor in the Department of Black Studies and English, Dr. Stephanie Batiste's Formation of Kinetic Affect, and feminist writer and independent scholar Sarah Amid's Positioning of the Orient as a Social Framework, to argue that my affective experience may help illuminate how the engagement of Filipino bodies with Philippine folk dance, both national and diasporic bodies, is persistently haunted by the legacies of Western imperialism. But also that, contrary to a commonplace of viewing Filipino bodies as colonized bodies, the possibility that Filipino bodies may also perpetuate the legacies of the empire is also imminent. That is, the Filipino dancing body is also capable of reproducing the power structure that was imposed upon them by the imperial project. Having said this, I contend that the perpetration of the imperialism through the Filipino bodies involved may have materialized and may be read in three ways. One, as a spur for the production of affective responses. Second, as a relentless pressure that maintains the circulation of ambivalence. And finally, as an after effect of being trapped in the narrative of racism. That is to say that the nightmares of Western imperialism are concealed, sustained, and projected by Filipino bodies as they cross paths, perhaps unnoticed and bearable in the homeland, but more apparent and unbearable in their interaction while in the diaspora. I remember that during the rehearsals, I started to feel uncomfortable about learning the folk dances I was assigned because of the disparities in the way those folk dances were taught to me, how I experienced learning them from my folk dance teachers, and the restaging of the folk dance itself. These accumulated experiences that left me ambivalent seemed to diverge from what Batiste offered as kinetic affect, which became a means for her to understand the dancer's formation of community within dance practice and its spaces. She pinpoints kinetic affect, quote, as a flowing presence in the performance of crumping and clowning among young hip-hop dancers of Los Angeles, California, which in turn enforces kinetic bonds of resonating communal connection, end quote. In contrast, I contend that what was missed as a circulating impulse is what Batiste refers to as the kinetic affect that creates communality. Instead, in my immersion with Filipino Americans, there seems to be an impending resurrection of the legitimacy of American imperial power. That the Filipino bodies, both in the Philippines and the diaspora, were iteratively manipulated to dance through the choreography of the Western Empire. Thus, I argue that my Filipino body and that of the Filipino Americans shared a dual performativity. One that engaged with Philippine folk dances that was made aware of our helping hand in maintaining the empire, and another that moved in the moment of encounter for the survival of the empire. At the onset of the paper, I began by pointing out an affective gap between my Filipino body and that of the Filipino Americans. Building from that premise, I forward that Filipino bodies in the homeland and the diaspora are essentially performing the same thing, bodies that dance through the disciplining of the imperial project. I assert that to disrupt the empire's maneuvers, the Filipino and Filipino-American dancing body should establish their engagement in folk dance with a confrontation of one's lived reality. In the words of Filipino Athabascan and Associate Professor of Psychology at the University of Alaska Anchorage, Dr. E.J. David, this lived reality may be seen as a, quote, very deep and solidified sense of weakness, vulnerability, and invisibility that brown-skinned, colonized, and forgotten person of color, end quote, have embodied, which they cannot just simply brush off. In the context of my affective experience, grasping my lived reality means sharing the moment, dancing in the present, and acknowledging the forces that brought two different bodies together, a non-stop development of the critical, even if painful, performance of Filipino-ness that never stops trembling in being affected, bothered, and conflicted. An act of challenging the normative, which for Ahmed is, quote, an effect of the repetition of bodily actions over time, end quote. Perhaps this proposition out of my relative experience may shed light on what difference would it make when the body is aware of where, how, and why it is orientated the way it is as the body decides to learn a certain folk dance. Although what I experienced was a different take on Batiste's theorization of kinetic affect, what was thought-provoking for me was seeing my affective experience as a mode of corporeality. The inextricability of affect from the body as it mingles with other bodies through my experiences may have just shown how a body can make theory when exposed to such situations. For Batiste, the actions of the body in the dance and the performance environment became a space for the body to theorize its movement through its physical expansiveness. In my case, the affective circuit became my epistemological space for understanding the reaction of my body. Both Batiste's example and my experience show how sociality is seen as relationality, as my body extends itself to the community where the transitive nature of affect may have circulated. What became accessible, which was then unspoken of or unquestioned for, was the articulation of a thriving charge coming from Americans' imperial legacy that the Filipino body in the Philippines and the diaspora tried to negotiate by feeling ambivalent or, quote, not feeling quite right, for Munoz. For Professor of Queer Politics and Aesthetics, Dr. Jose Esteban Munoz, to deal with not being quite right, one has to look at the circulation of affect built in relationality. As Dr. Munoz pointed out, quote, affect is supposed to be a descriptive of the receptors we use to hear each other and the frequencies on which certain subalterns speak and are heard or, more importantly, felt, end quote. The notion of deeply rooted national consciousness as a quest pursued in the process of learning a specific folk dance becomes apparent as Filipino bodies search what it means for them to engage in a colonially influenced and imperially shaped activity, such as folk dancing. It seemed to me that such experience may be considered as an effective cultural framework in nuancing racial meanings and constructing a temporally and spatially charged body. For Munoz, my experience of ambivalence may shed light on what feeling brown is all about. Quote, a mode of racial performativity, a doing within the social that surpasses limitations of epistemological renderings of race, end quote. So, how will the Filipino body wake up from the haunting of white supremacist hierarchies and corporeal constructions? Ignoring it just told my movement experience. Escaping it was unavoidable either. However, feeling ambivalent in being bothered, in questioning, and uncertainty, the Filipino body may be able to take the first step towards finding its way out of the darkness of being caged as docile bodies. That to wake up is to immerse in the affective circuit of ambivalence, to defy the lobotomizing impact of racialization. That to disrupt and break free from notions of racial identities, one should persist in kinesthetically and effectively mobilizing the Filipino body to move and never stop moving, whatever the cost. Therefore, ambivalence in the end may be read as a transgressive act of fighting back and unsettling the circling choreography of the empire that is capable of circulating, pulsating, and dancing despite the uncertainties that the Filipino bodies sensorially and affectively experience. In this sense, the implications of how race circulates in the constitution of the social and bodily space of an individual are vital. It may help one understand how bodies can arrive in corporeal negotiations that do not only refute the haunting of the silhouettes of white supremacy, but instead uphold a space where bodies can encourage each other to move despite the truths claimed by the project of race. It is in the space of embracing each other's embodiment that racialized bodies may adeptly move freely, despite knowing that dancing through it will never be pain-free. That in dancing through the toolbox of the empire, the Filipino body may be able to attune itself to a differently navigated choreographic agency that subverts the empire's canonized notation of folk dance and establishes alternative pathways towards learning Philippine folk dances. Looking back, I ask, why do I feel this way? In closing, perhaps I would say, I should feel this way. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, that's amazing. Okay, and again, let's go to the next presenter here. We have Peter Myles. Peter Myles' research interests include the rhetorics of space and public memory, visual rhetoric, ethnography, and post-colonial subjectivities. He is working on a monograph, Walled Memoria, Presencing Memory Sites in Intramuros, Manila, about the narratives and counter-narratives of various memory sites located within the former Spanish colonial center of the Philippines. He has a chapter published in the anthology Immigrant Scholars by the NCTE. He teaches at Carnegie Mellon. Peter, please.
Hello. All right. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to be reading just a summary of sorts from one of the chapters from that book project that I've been writing. And this one looks at a Chinese Filipino museum in Manila called Bahay Chinoy. And it's looking at that space. And so I'm trying to understand its narrative, the memories that it's presenting, and some of the counter narratives I think that I'm trying to sort of that I'm sort of like seeing as well. Right. So let me, I just have a few pages to read for you, and then I'm gonna share with you some photos from the museum as well. All right, so here goes. In my current project, I am examining the ways that public memory is being constituted in and constituted by a heritage site in Manila. Intramuros was a Spanish heritage district in Manila, constructed in 1590, and for much of the Spanish colonial period was its cultural, social, economic, and political center. In 1898, it became the seat of American government in the Philippines. Completely destroyed in 1945, Manila was the second most devastated city in World War II after Warsaw. Intramuros is now being restored and promoted by a state agency called the Intramuros Administration, or IA. The IA operates to what I'm calling as a defined yet unspecified neo-colonial Spanish mandate. It is defined as Spanish in the mission statement and various official texts. It is unspecified because it is unclear what they mean by Spanish. And it is a Spanish representation that Filipinos are not at all familiar with. I have had to make use of the word memoryscape to describe what I'm seeing in this heritage site. In Phillips and Reyes' appropriation, a global memoryscape is a complex landscape upon which memories and memory practices move, come into contact, are contested by, and contest other forms of remembrance. Older ways of remembering the past, largely framed in terms of national and local perspectives, are unsettled by dynamic movements of globalization, and new memories and new practices of remembrance emerge. As memoryscape, therefore, several memory spaces and practices within the walls of Intramuros question and complicate the dominant discourse that IA continues to perpetuate. In one chapter, I look at a Chinese-Filipino museum called Bahay Chinoy. As I've mentioned, the Intramuros administration operates with a defined yet unspecified neo-colonial Spanish mandate, and so has largely ignored the role and contribution of the Chinese in Philippine history. Not surprisingly, this practice falls in line with how historians have depicted the Chinese presence, describing them largely as a marginalized community suffering varying forms of exclusion, discrimination, and persecution at one time or another. During much of the Spanish colonial period, for example, the Chinese were forced to live outside the walls of Intramuros in ghetto-like communities called parian. Fearing revolt when their numbers grew too great, the Spanish officials perpetrated a series of massacres in the 17th century to decimate the Chinese population. In the 18th century, royal decrees were promulgated to expel the Chinese from the colony. This physical and bodily erasure later took on insidious legal form with the implementation of a series of exclusion laws during the American period and post-independence period. And the Filipinos' resentment at the foreign yet familiar presence of the Chinese grew and grew as the Chinese began to monopolize much of the local manufacturing and trading industry. Now that the Chinese have assimilated and occupy prominent positions in society, Bahay Chinoy serves a fitting symbolic space to claim their own place in history. Told largely through explicative gallery labels, life-size dioramas, photographs, and a hologram, the narrative of the Chinese in the Philippines covers pre- to post-Spanish colonial times, the Japanese occupation, and contemporary times. And because it is located inside Intramuros, just 2 blocks away from the main park, Plaza Roma, the museum also makes a spatial claim, not just inclusion, but centrality. As Mea Ang Si, volunteer director of Bahay Chinoy and daughter of its founders Chin Ben Si and Teresita Ang Si, proudly claims, not without a hint of irony, we're smack dab in the center of Intramuros. By depicting the Chinese as the central figure in its version of the Philippine historical narrative, Bahay Chinoy foregrounds their narrative and gives presence to the Chinese figure in historical time. In a sense, the museum is performing a laudable, even noble service for and to the contemporary Chinese community and the memory of the Chinese past by giving voice and the commemorative space to an ethnic minority in the Philippines that has been silenced for far too long. The response of the average Chinoy visitor has been overwhelmingly positive. Comments in their guest book include such exclamations as "finally," Ang galing ng Chinoy, or the Chinoy is great, and proud to be Chinoy. The museum's message of sharing in the troubles and triumphs of the Philippines and being united with the Filipinos is a favorable, unproblematic rhetorical stance and should engender feelings of solidarity with the Pinoy visitor. And yet, the message betrays the underlying and continuing ethnic tension between the Chinese community and the Filipinos. Borrowing Mary Louise Pratt's term, I characterize Bahay Chinoy as an autoethnographic space. In Pratt's definition, autoethnography is a text in which people undertake to describe themselves in ways that engage with representations others have made of them. Thus, if ethnographic texts are those in which European metropolitan subjects represent to themselves and their others, usually their conquered others, autoethnographic texts are representations that the so defined others construct in response to or in dialogue with those texts. In the case of Bahay Chinoy, therefore, the narrative of the Chinese that it presents is in direct response to how the official Philippine historical narrative has depicted the Chinese as a marginalized other. If they were once at the peripheries of history, then here at Bahay Chinoy, they have become its center. As a museum space, Bahay Chinoy serves as an inclusive space for the Chinese who were once excluded from mainstream society. However, I also argue that this inclusion that the museum performs simultaneously excludes the Filipino native. By claiming a shared history between the naturalized Chinese Filipinos and the natural-born native Filipinos, the museum simplifies a fraught historical relationship that elides differences, which consequently others the native Filipino, and thereby undermines the museum's salubrious message of solidarity. Let me show you a few photos at this point. So let me share my screen. All right, is everyone seeing this? Yep, all right, so this is near the entrance, the Chinoy, the Chinese was a Filipino, a shared destiny. So this idea of a shared destiny is sort of like the theme running throughout the entire museum. And you see these, for example, in this first diorama, this life-size diorama here, you see sort of like the first contact that the Chinese here, represented by this the silk trader, with the Filipinos of that time. This is pre-Spanish, pre-colonial, right? So you've got the Datu here, the leader of a particular tribe in the Philippines, sort of engaging with the Chinese silk trader there. I think this was during the time of colonial Spanish, right? So you've got the Chinese sort of like plying their trade, their wares, their goods, performing their work, being represented here in these different dioramas as well. And then it moves on to this sort of imposing image of a Chinese merchant, all right, during that time. And then you've got a Chinese owner of a sari store as well. And then this next photo comes from a later part of the museum exhibit, where you've got the present sort of like big businesses with the logos of these big businesses, all businesses owned and managed by the more prominent Filipino Chinese of today in the Philippines. And here are some of their patriarchal images of these taipans, right? You've got Gokong Wei, Henry C. of SM of Shoe Mart, right? The Shoe Mart malls, Lu Shutan, I think, who still owns Philippine Airlines, if I'm not mistaken. And then you've got all these other Chinese Filipino business owners as well. And then you've got the Chinese in action, sort of like being presented as saviors of the Filipino masses here in current time. All right. So you see this movement, right, where there's a centrality of the Chinese, and then the idea that it's supposed to be like a shared sort of history, and then it becomes more and more that the sharedness is not so, right? All right, so let me move on to my last few words. What Bahay Chinoy reveals is the contestatory nature of public memory as informed by transnational memories of other publics. As auto-ethnographic space, Bahay Chinoy houses a counter-memory that speaks directly to the official state-sanctioned memory that the Intramuros administration promotes. Yet this counter-memory must also contend with the memories of the mainstream Filipino society, and perhaps more importantly, the memories of other publics within their own Chinoy community. In the case of Bahay Chinoy, the public memory that they convey is drawn by the young, middle-class, educated elite of the Chinoy community. One, of course, wonders whether they are suppressing the memories of other Chinoys. To celebrate the coming into presence of a counter-memory is to be wary of the risk of counter-memory becoming reified in turn as official memory. Bahay Chinoy functions to provide an alternative narrative of the Chinese as the central figure in Philippine history. As an auto-ethnographic space, the museum speaks not only to the mainstream metropolitan center, but also their own community. But though it attempts to create communion with the Filipino mainstream by claiming a shared heritage and destiny, the ways in which figure and ground, space, time, and mass are manipulated to present the Chinese figure in dioramas, photographs, images, and the hologram function instead to distance the Pinoy, thereby undermining its goal of solidarity. My examination of Bahay Chinoy raises significant and intermingled issues regarding the question of belonging and subject positioning, the nature of counter-memories, and the fragile spaces that contain them. First, as a Pinoy myself, I'm not Chinoy. I'm only too aware of the difficult position of critiquing a marginalized community's own attempts at coming into voice from a supposed position of centrality and power. I'd like to think that I displayed, to use Said's term, a contrapuntal sensitivity to analyzing their situation. Nevertheless, there is the risk that my comments might be seen as partisan, insensitive, ungenerous, and in the end, repressive. But I suppose that is the nature of public spheres. Various publics compete to be heard, and when one is addressed, one must respond. I would rather my alternative reading of their alternative narrative be seen as the beginning of a dialogue, one that opens the possibility for negotiation and unsettles hegemonic interpretations. Second, related to the first issue, there's the risk of counter-memory becoming official memory. In the case of Bahay Chinoy, the public memory that they convey is drawn by the young, middle-class, educated elite of the Chinoy community. One, of course, wonders whether they're suppressing the memories of the other sectors of their own community. And this brings me to my third point. Bahay Chinoy, in order to gain legitimate presence in Philippine society, must reconceive itself into a more egalitarian space. Joining a consortium of private museums and holding modular exhibits outside of its own premises, Bahay Chinoy seems to be heading in the right direction. Clifford himself envisions a more destabilized museum and argues for a decentralized and circulation of collections in a multiplex public sphere, an expansion of the range of things that can happen in museums and museum-like settings. It sees the inclusion of more diverse arts, cultures, and traditions in large established institutions as necessary, but not as the only or primary point of intervention. For Bahay Chinoy, this would mean including voices not only from the other sectors of their community, but perhaps more importantly, the larger Filipino community. Ultimately, Bahay Chinoy must let in not only the Chino in the Chinoy, but the Pinoy as well, a real shared endeavor. Thank you very much. I end my presentation there.
Thank you. Okay, and let's see here. We have our final presenter here, Stefan Taralba. Stefan Taralba is a PhD candidate in English with a designated emphasis in Southeast Asian studies at the University of California, Riverside, focusing on late 20th and 21st century works of literature, performance, and audiovisual media. Their research examines how the artistic practices of queer and trans of color subjects enable reparative, anti-hegemonic reimaginings of relationality, belonging, selfhood, and collectivity. They are currently at work on their dissertation, which studies the radical world-making potentials of aesthetic representations of queer and trans of color everyday life. Their dissertation analyzes the artistic and literary productions by contemporary US-based queer and trans Filipinx-AO and Chicanx-AO artists and writers, including Mark Agujar, Now Bustamente, Kia Marcelo Junio, Zandra Ibarra, R. Zamora Linmark, Rigoberto Gonzalez, Isabel Sandoval, and Aurora Guerrero. Their work is forthcoming in Pacific Coast Philology. All right, please.
Yeah, thank you, Mary, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Mary and Chloe for organizing this and holding the space, and like thank you to everyone else, including and especially Jem, Peter, and Jeremy, for being a part of this experience and for helping to create the space and bringing it into fruition alongside me. Let's see. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my presentation. Um, can you all see this PowerPoint? Okay, I see some nodding. I'm also going to have notes. Are you all still able to see the PowerPoint? Because I have notes on my end, and I hope that you all aren't able to see anything. Okay, great. Yeah, so as Mary mentioned, I am currently at work on a dissertation. My dissertation is titled Brown Disorder, Messy Aesthetics and Queer and Trans of Color Lives. And yeah, it centers cultural forms by contemporary US-based queer and trans, Filipinx, and Latinx aesthetic workers. In particular, my dissertation studies the artistic representations of the everyday life practices of queer and trans racialized diasporic subjects across like 20th and 21st century works of literature, performance art, film, and video. And by focusing on depictions of the quotidian activities of queers of color, I investigate how minoritized subjects uncover possibilities for reimagining belonging, collectivity, and relationality through their everyday activities. And so the presentation that I'm about to give consists of various excerpts from one of my dissertation chapters. This one examines the quotidian activities of queer and trans undocumented Latinas and Filipinas in recent independent films. The films I'll be writing about or I'll be discussing include the 2013 film Mosquita Imagi, directed by the queer Chicana filmmaker Aurora Guerrero. And I'll be reading it alongside Isabel Sandoval's 2019 film Lingua Franca. Isabel Sandoval, for anyone who is not familiar, she is a trans femme Filipina filmmaker. She's been receiving a lot of attention in film recently. And to stay on time, I will offer very abbreviated analyses of one select moment in each of the films. So that is my plan. Sorry, I'm just like opening up the presentation right now. Okay. So here are some posters for the films. Lingua Franca, obviously, on the left, and Mosquita Imagi on the right. And I want to begin by evoking the queer theorist Christopher Nealon. So my thinking in relation to these films responds to a set of questions posed by Nealon in an interview that was published in GLQ. Quote, how are queer scholars' theorizations of alternative temporalities legible not only as attempts to think through the possibilities of movement and community, but also as attempts to think through or around or against the dominant form of the social organization of time, that is, the time of the commodity? How are touch or faith or wandering or speculation or delay related to that time? I contend in this talk that these films identify communion between bodies as generative locations that offer queer, racialized, diasporic subjects momentary transport out of neoliberal time and further modern time, i.e. the temporality of modernity. Within these two films, Mosquita Imagi and Lingua Franca, these moments of intersubjective communion manifest via everyday practices that create sites of intimacy between the film's undocumented main characters, such as these activities include sharing a bike ride or caressing one's skin. These moments of transport enable these characters to escape temporarily the violent regimes of slow death that structure the quotidian experiences of queer and trans racialized subjects. They further allow them to imagine their own modes of belonging that resist the state's supposed monopoly on belonging and inclusion via citizenship. These films represent everyday intimate life practices as locations that render accessible other modes of feeling, occupying, and experiencing time beyond the logics of heteronormativity, liberal progress, and the nation. So I'll begin with a reading of the film Mosquita Imagi. Released in 2012/2013, Aurora Guerrero's independently distributed feature-length coming-of-age film Mosquita Imagi follows the meandering and everyday activities of two Chicana teenagers living in the predominantly working-class Latinx city of Huntington Park, which is southeast of Los Angeles. First meeting in their high school geometry class, the two main characters, Mari and Yolanda, whom family and teachers call Yoli, and whom Mari affectionately nicknames Mosquita, begin a close friendship that eventually develops an unspoken homosocial dimension. Over the film's runtime, we watch the girls aimlessly explore their city and neighborhood, turning an abandoned industrial garage into their secret hangout where they study for class together and share their memories and hopes for the future. Mari's undocumented status fuels her apathy towards school, and she views formal education as an empty promise of an impossible futurity from which she is excluded due to her ineligibility for citizenship. In this way, Guerrero's film aligns with what Pamela Roberts and Wojcik has termed slow death cinema, which describes recent independent movies that depict the everyday experiences of marginalized populations whose precarious lives are shaped by exposure to regimes of slow death. The film represents Huntington Park as a space of simultaneous exhaustion, where working class inhabitants are exposed to toxic chemicals in the air as they struggle to make ends meet in order to work toward a quote-unquote better future, defined by neoliberal capitalist success. Mari, like many characters in other works of slow death cinema, engages in multiple forms of itinerant work in an attempt to help her mother pay overdue rent. Meanwhile, Yoli's parents work tiring blue-collar jobs in order to support their daughter's education. According to Wojcik, slow death in slow death cinema frequently manifests as involuntary mobility resulting from itinerant work or unstable living conditions. Guerrero's film, however, I posit, configures a slow death cinema aesthetic around immobility. Like many films centered around life as a teenager in the US, cars figure prominently in Mosquita Imagi as a space of heteronormative becoming, in which Yoli's school friends experiment with the activities of adult life. They drink, smoke weed, and practice flirting with boys while cruising around in friends' cars. For Yoli and Mari's parents, the car further conjures associations with sexual activity. After rumors surface that the girls have been spotted, quote-unquote, getting into cars with boys, Yoli's parents, who fail to recognize the budding homosocial bond between her and Mari, begin to worry when Yoli asks for permission to get a driver's license. Yet the car, rendered within the film as a site of heteronormative becoming, is a space from which Mari is continually excluded. Unlike Yoli, Mari is ineligible to apply for a driver's license due to her undocumented status. This exclusion estranges her from mainstream forms of growing up. As throughout the film, we see Mari getting around on a BMX bike, a noticeably more immature form of transportation compared to the more quote-unquote adult car. Mari's exclusion from the space of the car signals the ways that the heteronormative and progressive narratives of coming of age are embedded within the logics of citizenship. Further, it communicates her immobility, both literal and metaphorical, as an undocumented Mexican migrant. Yet in how it represents the immobility that conditions the lives of undocumented people, the film also imagines how placemaking practices located within everyday, intimate, embodied exchanges can open surprising possibilities for transport amid the stuckness and stasis of undocumented life. The placemaking practices that I describe here manifest via the ephemeral and seemingly inconsequential interactions between Mari and Yoli that allow these characters momentary transport away from the struggles that organize the everyday experiences of queer, racialized, and undocumented subjects. In one particularly moving sequence, we watched Mari and Yoli share a ride on Mari's BMX bike. Yoli stands on the back pegs, arms outstretched, while Mari pedals in front of her. The scene takes place in slow motion as Mexican indie pop artist Carla Morrison's dreamy and ethereal song Esta Soledad plays over the image, marking one of the few instances in the film in which extra-diegetic music with lyrics appears. The scene begins with an extreme close-up shot of Yoli's hair blowing in the wind. The camera then moves across Yoli's ear and face before moving to her outreached hand. Her fingers are extended to feel the passing breeze. In the context of the film's larger narrative, this scene is merely a transitional sequence that lasts only a few seconds, like around 8 to 10 seconds, and does not move the plot forward in any direct way. Yet this transitional sequence reveals how everyday intimate activities like sharing a bike ride can allow these characters momentary transport away from the struggles of daily life, and further, it enables them temporary escape from the demands of industrial time. Given how much of the film maintains a social realist visual grammar, the slow motion imagery of this brief sequence visualizes how quotidian interbodily intimate activities can open other modes of feeling and experiencing time. And within these more capacious inhabitations of time lie alternative possibilities for queer becoming that resist the mainstream logics of growing up, logics that are implicitly premised on belonging via citizenship. The short sequence renders the quotidian act of sharing a bike ride a utopic practice that transports queer, racialized, diasporic, and illegal subjects into a space of their own, where they can escape the exigencies of the majoritarian present. And from here, I'm going to move with no transition for the sake of time, I'm going to move into discussion of Isabel Sandoval's film Lingua Franca. Isabel Sandoval's 2019 film Lingua Franca follows Olivia, a trans femme undocumented Filipina caregiver who lives in New York City and makes a living taking care of an elderly Russian-American woman named Olga. She sends her wage earnings to her family in the Philippines as remittances, but her undocumented status complicates her future in the United States. While much of the film's plot focuses on Olivia's romantic relationship with Olga's grandson Alex, I focus here on the main character's encounters with the necropolitical structures of the state that work to expose trans, undocumented, and racialized subjects to precarity and violence. Achille Bembe famously employs the term necropolitics to name the ways that governments exercise their sovereignty by exposing certain marginalized populations to material destruction during ongoing and perpetual states of exception. These violent processes legitimize normative, i.e., white, cis heterosexual, subjecthoods as those worthy of life. The film highlights the myriad quotidian ways that these necropolitical structures of state power and violence shape the lived, everyday experiences of trans and undocumented subjects. Olivia and her friend Katrina, who is also a trans femme, undocumented Filipina, are continually betrayed by governmental documents like passports. In one scene, Katrina struggles to get her marriage legitimized because of discrepancies between her chosen name and the legal name that appears on her passport. While Olivia is outed later in the film, Olivia is outed as trans to Alex's transphobic friends once they discover her passport. The film also chronicles Olivia's perennial fears of being deported. The news stories of ICE raids and the vitriolic speech of the now former president that Olivia hears on TV and over the radio feed these anxieties. Yet amid these everyday instantiations of unexceptional necropolitical violence, the film proposes the erotic as a counterintuitive pathway toward liberation for Olivia. In one scene in the film, after listening to Alex read old love letters written by his grandfather, we see a montage of Olivia touching herself while recalling the sensuous language in the letters. In this poetic sequence, Olivia imagines sleeping with Alex, who appears in this dreamlike montage as a faceless body. This fantasy foreshadows Alex's and Olivia's later romance, thereby bringing together the story's present and future. While the film's predominant visual language can largely be characterized as social realist, much like Mosquita Imagi, throughout most of its runtime anyway, this surreal montage, complete with ethereal soundtrack and voiceover and impressionistic camera work, is a remarkably ethereal departure from the rest of the film in terms of its visual aesthetics. And how it briefly departs from the visual language of the rest of the film, this dreamy and sensual sequence is, for Olivia, a moment of transport away from the harsh realities of trans, undocumented racial life. Evoking the Black feminist Audre Lorde's powerful treatment of the erotic as a divine creative life force for all women, I read this sequence as more than a brief instance of banal sexual pleasure. I interpret the scene as a fleeting moment of utopic liberation rendered accessible through a practice of self-care. This instance of transportive freedom allows Olivia to escape temporarily the duress and melancholia of her everyday life. This sequence, in which Sandoval's character feels alive and in harmony with another body via her imagination, further allows her to contest the necropolitical structures that devalue the lives of queer, racialized, and undocumented subjects, by deeming their bodies worthy of pain and death. So in this very abbreviated talk, I have argued that these films reveal the liberatory possibilities for transport that are accessible via everyday, intimate activities performed by queer and trans, racialized, undocumented subjects. Within these moments of temporary escape exist possibilities for reimagining belonging and relationality that exceed the logics of citizenship, the nation, and neoliberal temporal, spatial, and social orderings. And I'm aware that I have a bit more time, but I would be really interested in just moving to Q&A to discuss our works. Here are some references for this paper, as well as references that I cite in the larger version of this chapter. And I'll leave it at that for now. So thank you. Thank you all.
Wow, thank you. Oh my goodness. Okay, well, okay, so I mean, you know, in this group right here, I mean, where should we begin with questions or goodness comments or anything else? Let's see. I see that we have other people here who are participating just by being our audience. I see a Jolivet, a Ying, and an Ed. Do any of you have questions?
I don't have a question so much as much gratitude for this panel. Thank you so much for all the presenters. I found it such a range of topics, but somehow still pretty interconnected. And I'll try my best to just kind of summarize the themes that I saw here. I thought that Jeremy's presentation was a really good kind of way to start off as an undergraduate, really just kind of thinking about the terms of model minority and microaggressions in relation to white supremacy and how Filipino bodies are read in media, and that how that's and in the larger narrative of Asians in film, in you know, U.S. film, and how that's been in Jeremy's argument, how that is connected with actual aggressions and assaults happening, you know, during anti-Asian attacks, and I found that was you know, just kind of, and Jem took that to. I was really interested in his argument about the circulation of affect in dance and just the embodiment of that tension, you know, with imperialism. So I thought, and Peter's discussion, you know, all that is really related to public spheres and public memory, and also in that sense of how, like in the Philippines, in the location of this museum in Intramuros, how that's read in that specific location, that tension between imperialism and the public sphere there. I really, you know, and I thought that Steph's presentation was a great way to kind of to end that, and really kind of thinking about. I liked his. I was intrigued by his idea about the visual grammar of queer becoming, and again, that the tension between citizenship and how that's tied with coming of age in a more kind of heteronormative logic. You know, did I do an okay job there? But so it was like, you know, I could kind of see how that was all really interconnected in this really powerful way. So thank you everyone for that presentation. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Let's see here. Well, I know that, okay. I see that there were some questions. Chloe directed me towards the fact that there were questions posted on Whova. It doesn't say who it's directed to, but I assume, okay, let's put this one towards Jeremy. The question asked was, how has the pandemic shaped the way Filipinos have been represented in Hollywood? Now, not just Jeremy, but anyone else, if they choose to answer that question. Anyone want to join in on that?
I do have like a response, but I also want to hear Jeremy's response.
Yeah, please.
You can go ahead if you want it.
Well,
still kind of.
Mine is kind of like a reply to yours, which is also kind of framed as a follow-up question. So I promise I'm not just like stalling for time. I just have a response that may work better as a response to your response.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting how the pandemic has really played a role in how Asian Americans and Filipino Americans have been kind of portrayed, especially since the pandemic. A lot of the kind of how I think speculation about where the virus came from and how society or people in this country kind of reacts to that kind of situation. It feels like the media is trying to kind of put a blame on someone or a group of people to let out their anger for because of the pandemic. And I just think it's really sad, but it's interesting how that kind of works, and it kind of brings attention to how Asian Americans and Filipino Americans have been represented in the media. But yeah, I'd like to hear Steph's response to this also.
Well, I guess my follow-up question is, and this I'm aware that this is totally kind of, I guess, like bringing my own research and scholarly investments in alignment with your work, and I might even be imposing something by doing this. And mind you, I do have friends who also write about representations of Filipinx American folks in mainstream media. But, because of my purview and because I write about independent film, I'm actually, I'm thinking about the ways that, like, what would happen if, we decentered Hollywood cinema as the place for looking for representations of, of like Filipinx folks, Filipinx American folks. Because Hollywood has its own like extremely terrible racialized problematic histories, right? So I guess my follow-up question to you is, like, have you considered looking into independent films slash other modes of, even like Philippine cinema or other kind of like filmic traditions that operate outside of mainstream media? And I guess, like, what are the, if you have, like, what are the like how do those depictions differ from those offered through like the mainstream, like majoritarian TV and cinema?
Yeah, so I feel like after doing the research for this kind of topic of representation for Filipino Americans, I've started looking into more independent films. I know there's this one film called Bitter Melon, made by a Filipino American filmmaker based in Los Angeles, I think. But I've also been following a few independent film festivals, just kind of focusing on Filipino directors and filmmakers. So, but yeah, I haven't really thought about kind of that question of looking towards independent films as the major source of representation. But yeah, it's something that's kind of I'm opening up to and kind of focusing more on, since Hollywood doesn't really feel like portray Filipino Americans as much. I think I also interviewed Masashi Nawano, who was in the video that I presented. He also made a point that Hollywood is more of a kind of machine. It focuses on what's more popular and what will make money. So if Filipinos in Hollywood aren't seen as kind of an investment, it might not be a viable kind of approach to that kind of sorry, I'm blanking out on my words, but
It just seems like the thing that, in short, they just want to say, where's the money, and
Yeah,
where's the commercial
basically.
aspect? How can we tie this to, say, a drink or a fashion brand or a lifestyle, or is there like a hashtag and then some kind of social media thing we can tie it to? They just want to have all those synergistic tie-ins, right?
Yeah.
Wanted to respond to Jeremy and say, sorry, staff, cutting off. I just wanted to say that there's also these social spaces like social media in particular, especially during the time of the pandemic, where like Filipino artists in the Philippines thrive into like doing live streams and all the stuff. But also I'm also thinking about Filipinos who are actually migrating to the US because they think that it's better there, especially the continuous onslaught of the pandemic in the Philippines. Like some Filipino artists are considering moving in the United States because it's safer, but also they also think about the opportunities that they wanted to get there and how you can actually complicate that in your analysis of representation, because some of these artists are not just Filipinos per se. Some of them are also Filipino-Americans or having dual citizenships, right? Traveling, transitioning from the homeland to the diaspora. So I also think about that. And I really encourage you to go to not just independent films, but other works that are not mainstream, because even in the margins, I think you can find a wealth of experiences or things that you can analyze to sustain or perhaps find more interest in forwarding your work. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is just like my cynicism, my jadedness as a result of being in the academy for so long. But personally, I'm just like trying to find validation in like mainstream Hollywood media, because it's just not going to give it to us. But there are other avenues, like other modes of cultural production, including independent, experimental, marginalized forms of media making, where that stuff is happening, right? I also want to, and maybe this is outside of your current project, and again, this is like totally just like inserting my own interest here, but I'm curious, like if there has been any work done on Jake Cyrus, who formerly went by Cherries Papengo. He uses he/him pronouns now, but he was on Glee a few years ago, and he kind of, I don't know, he has like a very interesting career trajectory in that at one point in time when he was femme presenting or cis femme passing anyway, he was like kind of like a big deal, like very like well known in like mainstream cinema or mainstream like media. But then as he like transitioned, he kind of fell out of like the mainstream limelight. And yeah, I'm just kind of throwing that out there as like, if I had endless free time, I would love to take that up as a project. But because I don't, I'm kind of being like, this could be a potential really interesting project as like a example of a Filipinx figure who was in mainstream media, but actually had this really interesting experience / negotiation with like the US mainstream mediascape. So a thing to consider as like another potential project if you go to grad school or something.
We have another question here, and again, it doesn't say who it's directed to, but I assume it's a question again from Huva. Someone posted, it says, what does it mean for Filipina X or Filipinos in the homeland and the diaspora to dance, quote unquote, together?
Oh, okay. That was actually I posted for myself, but I think about the ways that Filipinos in the homeland and the diaspora meet, not just in dance, but there's a lot of social spaces where Filipino, Filipinx bodies meet. I can just cite perhaps one case, like in Twitter, there's an array of topics where discourses on race and nationalism, identity, representation are being discussed. And I just tinker on the idea of what can you get out of, say, like what I presented today, ambivalence, or on conflict, on friction. I also think about the idea of when Stefan was presenting, I was also thinking about undocumented Filipinos in the US, both. And I think about this idea of the disintegration of bodies. So, and the body never resting in that case, the Filipino body in particular, never resting. So it's like, it's making me think about that when Filipinos in the homeland and the diaspora dance, say, for example, metaphorically or literally, it is always helpful to acknowledge the, perhaps because that time when I experienced it with Filipino Americans, it was a subtle experience. It was not something that was really pronounced up until I reflected back on it. So I thought it would have been helpful if I have acknowledged it right on the time when I have had that experience, and perhaps talked with one of the members of Katipunan, because it would have opened a lot of meaningful conversations regarding the questions that I was posing for myself, having experienced dancing with them, and not end up just reflecting back on it and seeing how that can be helpful in the process. So I thought acknowledging it, dancing with Filipino or Filipino Americans in the homeland and the diaspora, it would be helpful to acknowledge it first, and also think about ways on how you can still move forward, even if the say the topic is about something that you do not agree with. Because sometimes what happens there is when it's something that these two, say, people do not agree with, it ends up being like a sort of like pointing fingers conversation on who's right and who's not. I remember when the word Filipinx was first brought up to Twitter, and then there's like this divide of academics in the homeland saying, we don't use that and all. And then here comes, Filipinos in the diaspora pointing out how that can actually be helpful for some people as well. So those kinds of instances, I think it's helpful if on that point there's acknowledgement. It's also more like an open mind to discuss actually these important issues. So I think that's what it means really to dance with Filipinos in the homeland and the
Great. I have a question here, and I'm assuming it's for Peter. It asks, I would love to know how you nuance the presence of Chinese figure in the museum. I also think about urban streets occupied by the Chinese business workforce and the dynamics it brings in the cultural development in the city.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah.
I know it's kind of a question, kind of a statement. I would love to know how you nuanced the presence of Chinese figure in the museum. I also think about urban streets occupied by the Chinese business workforce and the dynamics that it brings in the cultural development of the city.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it's something I think that I can't really sort of like address in the time that we have right now, because I think it's more, I mean, it's much more complicated. I mean, we're looking at a history that spans like centuries, right? So but the thing that I can say about that in response is, as far as sort of like nuancing the presence of the Chinese in the museum, I mean, it's everywhere, right? I mean, you're reading the entire exhibit. The Chinese is represented in dioramas, in figures, right? In actual figures, in one very interesting space, a hologram, right? Which I thought was interesting as well. Just the idea of the ephemeral nature of it is interesting. But yeah, so I think as far as sort of like reading the Chinese presence in the museum, it really is central, right? You're seeing the the Chinese figure and the Chinese presence as being centralized throughout history, at least in their narrative, right? And I think that's an interesting sort of position to take, right? It's really a counter memory against the official narrative, where Chinese are seen as this minority, right? That they're excluded from actual Philippine history, or excluded or marginalized, right? And what's fascinating about the museum is that, as I said in my presentation, the Chinese is the central figure, right? It's their narrative that you're seeing. But the only thing that I think that's my main critique about that is the idea that they're presenting it as a shared narrative, right? And it's interesting probably in the first half of the museum, the first couple of floors, I think, but once you get to the third floor, it becomes really more all about them, right? And how they've become sort of like this dominant presence in terms of the economy, right, in the Philippines. And you can see that in actuality for the last few decades, starting from the 50s, right, when the likes of Henry C started coming in and started putting up, I think SM was sort of started around that time, pretty much after the war. And so they became this sort of like very dominant titans of the economy in the Philippines. And that's not to say, of course, that there's also a huge population of very poor Chinese, the Chinese who came in before them, right? Who were sort of like forgotten by their own community as well, right? So as far as sort of like nuancing the story of that in the museum, I think there's some stories that are being suppressed, and then some stories, as usual, that are being sort of highlighted and brought out. As far as how the economic sort of like segment of the Chinese population is influencing the cultural landscape of the Philippines, I'm not so sure, but I can only think of the businesses, right? So I'm thinking about the likes of like Jollibee sort of like influencing the food sort of like culture of the Philippines, right? Which of course this has been going on for quite a few centuries now, right? With the influx of the Chinese in pre-Spanish colonial times, of course, you've got all these different kinds of Chinese food, and even now, I think it's very difficult to sort of like separate what is Chinese from what is Filipino food already, right? So pancit is very much Filipino in this case, right? And yet its origins are very Chinese or very sort of like Asian in a way. So and it's very difficult to distinguish those differences already in this case. And I think that's part of the culture of the Philippines as well, right? That we're made up of all these like very different cultures, very different sort of like ethnicities, that I'd be hard pressed to sort of like really point to what makes something purely Filipino, what makes something purely Spanish, what makes something purely Chinese, and so on, right? So that's an attempt at an answer to that question/statement, I think.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Thank you. Chloe, should I read the last question? I know it's 3:50, but I mean, I'm up for it if all of you are.
I'm very down to continue.
Okay, Chloe, yes?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. We have a last question. And again, it doesn't say who, but I assume this is for Steph. It asks, I'm interested to know the intersections of care, again, in quotation marks, in both of these works.
Yeah, as I was putting together my PowerPoint today, I was like, oh yeah, I titled this Erotics of Care, but then I don't actually talk about care very much in this version of the paper, because it's like excerpted from different pieces of a longer chapter. So I guess that's the pitfall of titling something like 6 months before you present it. I think so. In the longer version of this chapter, even though the chapter is still kind of centered around care, it's also centered around these moments in these two films in which the film kind of disrupts its own visual language, right? I describe both films as social realist, but there are these really interesting moments where, like, for example, the film has like a slow motion sequence, or the film kind of bends time and space in this really interesting way. Like it imagines character, or it imagines something that will actually happen later in the film. In the case of Lingua Franca, and what I'm interested in these moments is how these like really, and they're always like really brief transitional sequences. They're never like anything that's like central to the story. They're always like brief transitory moments in the film, but these temporary, like very quick reorientations of space and time signal the ways that queer and trans undocumented racialized subjects kind of continually negotiate their relationships with space and time, and in some ways through like certain, as I argue, through certain kind of like intimate everyday activities that are premised on vulnerability, like sharing a bike ride with someone that you love or care about. They can allow for these moments in which these characters can step outside of time, right, and therefore maybe queer and trans undocumented, and therefore pointing to possibilities for agency that are not I don't want to say agency, possibilities for freedom, but also like belonging and care that kind of fly under the radar of the majoritarian culture, because they're not often perceived as forms of like care and collectivity and belonging, because care has a certain kind of connotation especially in like Filipinx studies. Care has a certain connotation around like medicine, as well as a certain kind of like gendered racialized labor. But yeah, in thinking about these kind of moments of spatio-temporal rearrangement and queer undocumented characters kind of enacting those rearrangements, they're able to uncover these alternative spaces of care where they can kind of be with others, outside of kind of the demands of mainstream neoliberal capitalist culture, which ultimately is always kind of working to exclude and even kill undocumented subjects, right? So in that sense, that's how I'm sort of thinking about the politics of care in these two films.
Okay. So Chloe, do you want to have any final words or?
Yeah, we just want to say thank you all for being part of this session. We hope that there will be more in the future. This has been sort of Mary's and I's dream. Oh, hi. Dream. And we hope that we'll have more in the future, not just in PAMLA, but in other places as well. One other note, a colleague, Naomi Siggs, is looking to start a group. And if you're interested in joining, I left a Google Doc there for you to fill out if you're interested. But Mary, did you have anything to say? Or
there's so much. I was just jotting down questions for I don't know, each person or so, but just things that came to mind that the space does not allow for, because I wanted to read, like you said, the questions that were left for us on Whova. But I mean, I guess we can all exchange emails or however we want to communicate to each other, just some of the questions we have for each other. You know what I mean? Again, this space doesn't allow for, but I hope that, again, if things are, as far as, well, things pandemic wise better next year, that wherever they hold PAMLA, we can see each other again, maybe in person, or again, if it's virtual, but just to, discuss more scholarship that's out there.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and collect everyone's emails and I'll send it all out to the group. I think that's the best way.
Yeah, just like things, I don't know about you, Chloe, but things were popping in my head as, let's say, Peter was reading, I'm like, hey, what about this? But then, things like that I just said, okay, no, let's hear what everyone has to say, give them the floor, and then if there's time, but thankfully there were really great questions posted that I thought, yeah, let's give that the floor, and then we can just ask each other questions at another time. Yeah.
Absolutely. I have many questions, many like hopefully generative questions for everyone here. Especially, including Jem, but I can interact with Jem literally anytime. We're in the same school.
Yeah, Jen, did you have a question? You turned your camera on, so I wasn't sure. No, okay.
Thanks. I just I didn't hear everything, but I caught the tail end. So thanks for sharing the link and everything, and just kind of creeping on Ed's account. He's sitting here, but I'm sitting at the computer. So thank you.
Well, thank you all. We don't want to keep you. We're 7 minutes.
I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
there might be other, yeah, but thank you all so much. I hope, Chloe and I hope to see you again next year or in some iteration of another academic type conference, right?
Thank you, Mary and Chloe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Oh
you,
my God,
everyone.
thank you, everybody.
Take
Take
care.
care,
Stay
everyone.
safe.
Take care. Be safe.
Bye.
Bye. Chloe, stay.
Okay, I'm gonna stay. Thank
Okay.
you. That was great, Mary.
Oh
I'm
my
so
God, Chloe, yay! Yay!
yeah, that was really good.
Oh my
And the
gosh.
range, you're right. There, I didn't think about the I didn't. I love what Jolivet said about the ordering of things. I didn't think about it. Right, we just sort of wanted to get Jeremy to go first.
Yeah, you know, and here I'm taking a picture of this. You're gonna see me
Send
post
it to
this,
me.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know what? I'm you know, okay, the range of papers, amazing, you know, and then the way we decided the order of who would appear first, second to last was great. It was this wonderful progression. I like starting with Jeremy. You know, it was a good like we always see these types of essays on representation, a good kind of just starter, and then to just end with something that Steph's doing. That's, you know, well, with Steph and Peter, that's like wow, you know. And then with Jemuel, I wanted to ask, like, I mean, you know, I don't, I'm not here for chismes, but at the same time, it's like, what happened? You know,
Right.
like,
I wanted to ask that.
what was it like? And no offense, because like,
Yeah.
you know, I have my own opinions on when I see these, either it's Katipunan or SC PASA groups. Just because I witnessed, like, okay, my cousin, he went to UC Irvine, right? So he was part of, I forgot what fraternity, that's all Filipino. And then his wife, she went to the, you know, sorority, she attended some sorority there, again at UC Irvine and all Filipina. And I just like witnessing how they had their little Filipino cultural nights, right? PCNs and all that. I just thought, okay, is this like just an excuse to like just meet guys and meet girls and just kind of show off your cars and what I mean, and in a way, should I disrespect that in any way? But at the same time, I mean, this is where, again, I wonder if that's what Jemuel was hinting at, was like, where's the culture? You know what I mean?
Yeah, you know,
I wonder.
I do want to share this with you, and I don't know, because I don't know what really happened. I had a really hard time when we first moved here, mostly because I felt really alienated from the second generation Filipino AX folks, right? Like I think there was like this, like I felt like I was out, I wasn't Filipino American enough. And then at the same time, they were also saying that, you know, they were saying like, these are the Filipino sort of stereotypes or like whatever it is. And I'm like, but that's not how I came from the Philippines. And that's not what really happened. So there was this sort of tension. And it was really hard to reconcile. It took me a long time to. So I guess when he said that, I was like, I can see where the tension is because there was that sort of, I don't know what to call it. In fact, one other thing, somebody else mentioned just on Friday, I think he was saying something about, you know, some of your folks, Chloe, I don't think have recognized how, you know, like that's colonizer kind of behavior, right? And in the guise of, but we're like this Filipino group, but I think behavior is very much like what Jemuel was describing. Yeah. So I don't know. I want to kind of get in touch with him, but
I guess I'm curious because, like, you know, I just, what happened? You know, like just on a pure basis like that, because, like I said, what I saw was from just, and this is, maybe it's different now at UC Irvine, I don't know, but just what I saw with my cousin and his wife and their little group, and how, you know, we were invited to see Philippine culture nights, stuff like that, and it just seemed like an excuse to, and I'm not against it. Yeah, you want to meet people who are similar to you and have a large dating pool, fine and all. And then, but then you put the whole Philippine cultural flag on it, then it's like, really? You know, but at the same time, I mean, I don't want to piss on people's enjoyment either. I mean, there was, people shared, like there were dances done, I guess authentic. What do I have to know, right? I have nothing to base it on. I've never been to the Philippines. I can only base it on what I see on TV, what my parents remember and describe to me. So it looked authentic enough that I just didn't like how, I mean, it was kind of like,
but
now again,
also, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, like the whole colonial mentality the dancing or being like more like the empire and reiterating that. See, now I have to remember what parts did I see, but, or maybe it was, just a reappropriation of hip hop. I don't know. Maybe that's what I saw a lot of too, that I said, well, wait a minute, I know these are Filipino bodies dancing, so it's Filipino, but, and this is where I don't want to, again, like disrespect anybody. Is this still an expression of the culture, right? I don't know. So, we can, again, this is where as academics, we debate back and forth, but I was just curious, like, wow, what happened, and then B, is it, because I'm curious to learn from a Filipino lens, not just a Filipino American lens. Yeah. What were they doing,
But you're right. But also one thing that, some of these groups, most of them are kids, right, to a certain degree. So like I don't want to like minimize that, but at the same time, what is their purpose, right, or their motivation for joining the group? Sometimes it's just to get friends, or make friends, find someone to date, or whatever it is, like you said, right?
I'm not going to piss on that, no.
But you're right, but maybe we need a more intentional sort of like interrogation of these groups. What are we doing? Who's what behaviors are we perpetuating, right, or ideologies are we perpetuating?
Is there an adult in charge to go, okay guys, this is great, however, let's recenter this on how do we emphasize the Filipino in this? And it's not just a Filipino guy dancing,
right?
How is this Filipino in culture? How do we reassert that? But is there an adult there present to do that?
Right. Yeah.
So I had questions about that, and with Jemuel and with Peter, I was wondering, in that exhibit, how do they talk about the Chinese Filipinos, the Chinoys, during the Marcos regime? Where were they in that? Were they kind of like, we're here to fight for freedom, we hate this guy, or you know what I mean? Or is it not about, or they just don't get political, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But you can't help but tackle the whole Marcos regime, and that whole historical perspective of it, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to pull up the thing to see if we can find it, the museum.
Just because I'm curious about that, like how do they position themselves in that 20-year time?
Right.
Did I include, did I ever tell you my dad, he's cousins with Marcos?
No, I didn't know.
My dad, he's cousins with Ferdinand Marcos and Manuel Ramos, the guy that came out, not after him, because two guys, well, okay, but Ramos was the other president after Corazon Aquino, right?
Right.
Yeah. So my dad's related to both of them.
Oh my gosh. So does that change the way is that why your parents moved to the United States?
My dad moved, you know what, when he came to the States, he was only like 18, right? 18, 19. He joined the Navy because that was the way that Filipinos could get to be American citizens. And he didn't, so according to my dad, he wanted to be an American because he remembers as a kid, they had an American teacher, and then the war came, and then all that time, he was living in Manila. So after Manila got bombed the hell out of it, they moved back to the country, and he just still loved all the American things he had back in the city, the movies, the food. It's like he missed seeing. I guess to him, the American colonialism was just this wonderful time, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Because of all the stuff that they had.
Yeah, but there are some, we can't ignore that there are some like real material or status sort of benefits, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, after that, so then he, so then the war goes away, and then he grows up, and he's like, that was always in his mind, right? To just come to the States. And so he did, he came to the States, but his mom, my grandmother, I never met her. She died before I was ever born. According to my dad, she wanted him to stay. So she wanted him to work for his cousin, but my dad was like, no, I don't want to ruin what I have going on here. I want to, stay here. So he stayed here. he didn't go and join forces over there and try to work for him in any way. I know other family members who their fathers went and worked for him because that's how cronyism works, right? You ask your cousin to get you a job in the government, and they did. They had these incredible lifestyles, but my dad was just so like, no, I want to be here. And he saw how, it's not going to last long. You live like that, it's not going to last long. The house of cards is going to crumble, and it did, didn't it? So,
well, my dad would say, though, he jokes around. He goes, if you were, a Marcos crony, though, if you would have come back, you would have a couple estates in San Francisco, and you would be you would have. So your dad's a good person. I know. Yeah.
Well, yeah, he didn't pursue it, but you know what? He kept in touch with Marcos. My dad has letters to him. He wrote to him, and he wrote to Ramos, because I think Ramos was somewhere while Marcos was being president. Ramos was somewhere in the Congress doing something representing the area that they came from.
Yeah.
And so my dad, I have, when my dad died and my mom died, and then we had to move and pack up everything, I found all these letters my dad wrote to Marcos and Ramos.
You should write about that.
I guess so. I don't know. I need to, well, first of all, in all the boxes we have in the garage, I need to find them, right?
But you should, come on, he had the public and the personal persona, right, of Marcos.
But it's funny, as much as my dad didn't want any part of that, he just was like, politics there is dirty. Everyone knows that, right? From top to bottom.
Politics just in general.
Exactly. He knows that. So, and yet you would think, well, he's a relative, he should have just joined in anyway, but no, he didn't anyway. So, but he says politics is dirty, and he didn't want to get in that. And even though not shaking the family tree, he could have been better off, but he didn't want a part of that, I guess. And that's all he ever told me. And I kept questioning him, like, well, there's more to it, right? But that's all he ever told me. You know what I mean? So whatever secrets he has, givings or anything else he didn't tell me, I guess he takes to the grave. You know what I mean? But somewhere I found all the letters that they wrote to each other, him to Marcos and to Ramos.
Oh, yeah.
I know, I need to look for that.
I'm just saying, if we're going to do this next year, that could be a possible thing for you to write about.
Maybe. But he, as much as he knows how dirty it is and how wrong it was to declare martial law, it's like every Filipino, you stick up for the person from your hometown, you stick up for your family, so as much as he knows how dirty it was and how, Marcos at the time was really dirty and everything he did, he'll still say, I
family values, right?
You support,
we just value family so much. It's so
you support hard. Your family, you support people from your hometown because they might as well be related to you anyway.
Right.
So he'll support him. And it's funny, one of my best friends from preschool, Heidi, she says, Mary, every time I remember your old house, I always remember your dad having a huge poster of Marcos. My dad had a huge poster of Marcos, and all the newspaper clippings. He had a little, a scrapbook, of everything Marcos related. And she'll say, I always remember that about your father, So even though he knows that guy was dirty, he'll still support him no matter what.
And that, just Filipino value, like a core value, right? Family, blood is thicker.
No matter what.
Right? Yeah. It's
like, okay.
Yeah. That's the hard, I have friends who's like, why don't you do that? I'm like, but she's my aunt. I can't not. What do you mean? It's a hard thing to learn, or I don't want to. Anyway. Yeah. I need a break from the computer, Mary.
Yeah.
Do we want to set up a time to write up the next thing?
Sure. Okay.
Or is that too soon? I don't know.
No, not at all.
Yet. You know when it's gonna come out?
Is it not out now, on the Whova site?
I don't think so. Unless you.
Let's see here. Hold on. Let me close this.
Let's see.
See here. It's not on the Whova site.
Let me just put PAMLA 2022.
Yeah. Here. Okay.
Not yet.
No, or not even on the PAMLA site either.
Right, yeah. So should we just wait and see until they
Yeah.
post it? Then we can, this is
Yeah.
fun. This has been,
Yeah, we'll
and
probably get another email, right?
yeah. So let's do that.
I'll do that for your friend Naomi Siggs. I'll fill that out.
Yeah.
I'm interested, okay? But yeah,
no, go ahead.
No, yeah, I'm interested. But yeah, like we'll let's have a bit of a break. Maybe, just like a 2-week break or so. I mean, definitely after Thanksgiving. How about after Thanksgiving we come back together? Because what we have this week and then Thanksgiving's coming up, right?
Yeah. And we do need a break. We should really honor time and all of this stuff.
And then now you said you're gonna contact everybody and get their emails or something.
Yeah, I'll share their emails with
yeah because I mean, definitely want to ask Peter about that. And then
I should write that down right now.
Steph, I mean, wow, I need to see those movies, so that's wonderful. I wonder, and maybe this could go to Jeremy or Steph. I was thinking of, back in I want to say it was the 1990s. I don't know the name of the director and writer, but the name of the movie, The Debut, when it came out and it starred Dante Bosco.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I wonder if Jeremy or Steph saw it. Could that film be made now? Especially, it's so centered on a young Filipino male and this portrayal of, well, his identity, but also related to like a ultra masculine type of sensibility. I wonder if that, it's unfair to ask this, but at the same time, have you seen that? Could that movie be made now, or how would there be an updated version of that movie? I mean, because now, we need to reconsider sexual identities too, as part of the diaspora, right?
Yeah.
That's a question I just had, but so many questions. This was a great panel.
This was very rich. And I think Jolivet wanted to submit too, but I think she was making space for her student.
Sure. Well, I mean, if she just nurtures it now, works on it now, if we, let's say we come up with a title and all of that, and she just nurtures it now a little bit by little bit, if she doesn't mind even thinking about it during the Christmas break, and then March, April, we put out the next post.
Yeah.
If she takes the time now to just do baby steps.
Okay, Mary, I'm done. That I felt like I was like on for the last 2 hours.
I know.
Yeah. I think I need a break. I still got a lesson plan.
Oh, yeah. No, but you know what? You did a good job.
You did an awesome job. You're a natural.
Am I?
Yeah, like I can't, like I have to write everything down because otherwise I'll get really like, blah, blah.
Oh, no. But I think, you know what? Next year, like I said, hopefully we'll